Welcome to another episode of the PDF at Work podcast presented by Foxit. Today we're talking about accessible government information, and of course we're looking at it from a PDF point of view. This episode is a bit different because other than usual, it's not me asking the questions. Tim Coulthard from GovX Digital is going to ask, and David Wilde and I will have to answer them. Many thanks to Tim and David from GovX for this great discussion. But see yourself. Hope you take away useful insights about accessibility for government documents in PDF.
So Carsten, David, it's great to have you join us on the GovX Show. David, many of you will recognise and have seen before, but Carsten, new to the show. So perhaps you could just start off by introducing yourself, telling us a bit about your background and some of your areas of interest.
Yes, of course. Thanks, Tim. My name is Carsten Heiermann. I'm by education an electrical engineer with a special focus on information sciences, although that is like ages ago. I'm in the industry for 25 years now, 20 years with a strong focus on PDF technology. I founded my own company in a PDF software company in 1995, focused on PDF solutions for mostly the automation and the mass production part, right? So when you have to send out a whole lot of PDF documents like statements or something like that, my software would have done it. And I sold this company to Foxit, as you can see up there, or Foxit is my current employer 5 years ago, and I'm chief evangelist there now. And therefore now looking at a full PDF portfolio from editor to desktop to mobile to automation, which is my source, SDKs, as well as all the way into e-signing solutions. I'm also serving in parallel on the board of directors of the ODA, the Open Design Alliance, focusing on CAD drawing conversion to PDF and stuff like that. And also as a founding member, I'm on the board of directors of the PDF Association, an industry organization where all the PDF software vendors come together to talk about how to interpret the standards. With regards to government and accessibility, my software was always trying to put a focus on automating the tagging, the structuring of PDF for accessibility. It is not limited there, but government agencies sometimes seem to take the need for accessible documents more serious. So we have a lot of government customers more serious than the overall industry, I'm saying. So we had a lot of government customers there, public service customers around the world, like the NHS in the UK, or lots of state and local governments in Germany and Europe, and also larger agencies in Canada and the US.
Great stuff. And we're gonna get into some of those aspects of accessibility. I know, David, you and I have spoken in the past about how accessibility and the ability to access information is such a sort of central core of democracy and fairness and inclusion. So interested to start to unpack some of the elements about how technology can assist in that, where we're headed, where we're going in the future. Some really interesting, juicy topics that we're going to get into, I'm sure, in the next sort of half an hour, 40 minutes. But David, maybe you could just introduce yourself as well, particularly around your experience around this piece, accessibility, and sort of how public sector can serve up digital information that keeps its citizens in the loop, keeps them informed, keeps them included.
Yeah, good. So, yeah. So as we said before, I spent the best part of 35 years in central and local government before went into more sort of commercial ventures and what have you, and obviously the GM stuff here with GovX. But during those 35 years, I've always been very heavily involved in the whole transparency agenda, way back from the early days of data protection all the way through to where we are with GDPR and eGDPR as we are now. But critically underpinning all of that has been diversity and inclusion and equalities, which kind of underpin the reality. It's not about just making information available, but it's also making information accessible and usable for the population. Long held the view, apolitical view, that public is here to serve the population that elects it and that it looks after. Therefore, what governments should do is make the information they have easy to use and understandable by that population. And when you stick to that kind of central tenet, that drives a lot of behaviours that are right and proper around transparency in government, the thing I've constantly battled over the years with is when government agencies don't want to do that, which is in the nature of democracy and in the nature of administration. And the kind of stuff that I picked up on back in the early days, turn of the millennium, I was involved in writing the UK government web guidelines, and we were very, very active in those days. In the early days of WAI with WCAG, let's chuck in some acronyms with our friends in the W3C, back in the old World Wide Web Consortium days of the mid-90s onwards with Tim Berners-Lee and co. But I think that set some really good foundations on which the technology world was beginning to show even then that borders should not stop this. And that standards at a global level are absolutely critical to the success. And it was fascinating to watch that play through against the vendors, who I think it's fair to say, and we'll probably pick up on some of this, Carsten, I think some of them were in a very different place back in those days. And the question we can go on and ask through this is, have they moved? How far have they moved? Because I think, you know, consumer, resident, business, member of society, whatever you want to call them, you know, government should be held to account. Government should be transparent, and we should be able to use these technologies to help make this happen.
Yeah, 100%. And Carsten, picking up on that, we talk about accessible government, and I think often we make the statement, but I'd like to sort of stop and think about why does accessible government, accessible public information really matter? And I guess what are those implications if we don't get it right? If we haven't got the right guidelines, if we haven't got the right technology, what are the implications for our society, for our government, for you know, everybody involved?
That's a very broad question. So first, maybe we have to look at, or let's assume that government information as such matters. Okay, I think when we get on the same page with that, and then it matters to give access to it, right? Just taking a little bit from the funny angle, but seriously, there are rules and regulations we just have to follow inside and outside of the government world. But I am personally not a big fan of just because of the rules kind of arguments or threats, like in case of a violation, or we have to have somebody being responsible for it or something like that. Because these rules and regulations are there for a reason, and it sometimes is easier to explain why it matters and what is the reason, because the regulations are just trying to hard enforce the regulation, right? And giving access and allowing inclusion can't be limited from my point of view. And some might take this as not like a super big problem. The numbers of people who are actually blind or has other challenges or something like that is not a very high percentage of the population, but the percentage in the population has actually challenges with reading certain documents is very big, right? I'm 53 years old. I'm using a multifocal, and I still struggle with what some creative people might call design work in documents, right? Talking about low contrast, some white on a light blue or something like that. Why is that, right? And seriously, government documents matter and have an effect, so we have to take care. Could end there, period, right? But obviously there's a downside, and we'll talk about that as well. Less awareness for creating accessible documents, or creating accessible documents while creating documents is a problem, because the work to fix a document in the end of the process is very hard, is very, very difficult sometimes. It is way easier if we would all make it a habit, like from the get-go, like automatic, right? So I guess we need to start using the right tools on the one hand to make it easy enough that everybody happily does it, right? Accessibility checkers built into our Foxit PDF editor, for instance, and these kind of things that help you getting there or doing it as a not so challenging task. And mostly starting with education of government employees on how to get it right in the first place, like how to use your word processor correctly and things like that, right? And then we'll get there. Again, top down is important, but I think also a very important component of implementing a habit of just taking care of everybody, making it accessible from the get-go, is also a bottom-up approach that we need to take there.
Yeah, 100%. And I think, you know, governments pump out huge amounts of information. It's, it's almost at the core of what they do. And so, like you say, getting to that at source and building to the best practice and behavior into not just the people who are responsible for the document compliance, but the people that are creating across every tier of an organization. I think that's a sort of fundamental that we need to get to grips with. And obviously there are guidelines out there, like we have the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, WCAG. They're a real driver of the creation and sharing of information and best practice. So looking at those sort of specific aspects, what are some of those key components that public sector organizations need to be aware of and considering? And then how can we use tools like PDFs and formats like PDFs to sort of make a better fist of it? Maybe Carsten, you have a crack at that one first before we come to David.
At least I can talk a little bit about WCAG and then also look a little bit at the aspect on how PDF is helping with that, right? So WCAG, or WCAG, as we say, is an ISO standard. So it's a global applicable standard, like PDF itself as well, and also PDF UA, which is the Universal Accessible PDF. So that is all ISO standards, all ready to use, let's say. And WCAG describes principles for universal accessible, and then in brackets, web content, right? Using rule sets. These rule sets, I mean, from a technology standpoint, these rule sets are, by the way, 61 criteria on how to create accessible document. The most easiest example on what it describes and what it does, and that everybody can understand immediately, is that it demands or requires, for instance, to put in an alternative text when you add an image to your content, right? So you put an image in there, and again, education, bottom up, from the source. In the moment you put an image in there, there should be an automatic habit to say, here's my alternative text that says in a couple of words on what's shown on that image, because that helps accessing the content. Other than that, it's blocked, it's out, right? Nobody can use it. So that's just one example of the 61 basic criteria that we have in WCAG. Yeah. Now, with regards to PDF, I said we have PDF UA, a Universal Accessibility Standard, that is basically the interpretation on how to apply the WCAG principles to PDF. Why do we need to do this? Because PDF on the first view is a visual representation of a document only. So it's called portable document format. It is from the times where on a Mac or a Windows, a single document would look very different, right? And PDF was designed to have the document look the same, whether it's on the printer or on any kind of computer. It's about how to paint the page, more or less, on a computer screen so that it looks identical. It's not so much about how to consume that page or read it, right? So for instance, imagine a newspaper front page. Where to start? What's next? What's first, right? This structure is like completely missing in a non-tagged, in a regular PDF. So in order to make it a structured text where you can then start to apply the WCAG principles to make it accessible, you have to put structures in like, this is an H1, a headline 1. This is H2, H3. This is a standard text. This is an article. This belongs together. This is the reading order of this newspaper page I was talking about before. It's not enough to say all headlines look the same and they are 16-point bold, right? So they have to be tagged as H1. If you do that in a PDF, you create a whole extra layer of PDF, the so-called tags or tagging. Tags are old news in PDF. They are out there since PDF 1.4. It's a long while ago, but not used very much. And by the way, using tag PDF helps you not only to make the documents accessible, but it also helps you to use the structure for things like reflow. Look at the same document on a very small screen, from watch to wall, right? So, and then you have to reflow it. And if you have a structure, you can easily do it. If it's just an image, you cannot do it, right? Screen readers are supported by tagging. It helps us telling apart between artifacts, like the page numbering. And if you read a book out loud by a screen reader, and on every page it says the headline of the book, the headline of the chapter, and the page numbers, it's getting very, very, very odd experience and the reading order. I'm getting a bit long here, but PDF UA now is an ISO standard saying how to apply WCAG principles to PDF. So it's an ISO standard. by the way, out there since 2012, believe it or not. So we have this technology available for a long time. We just need to use it. It's based on the PDF ISO standard 32000. And this standard's nature is some of that, what is written in there is something like PDF language, font embedding, use Unicode, this kind of technical things. But part of that also is semantic. For instance, there is a tag has to match the content. What does that mean? And who decides that, right? Maybe not a machine. PDF UA has even more rules than the basic rules of WCAG. It's 136 rules in there and checkpoints to say whether a document is PDF UA compliant. Some of them are machine detectable, which is very good, right? Then we can use an automation, both in creation and in checking whether a document is accessible, and we can offload that burden from our workforce, right, to not slow them down too much. But bad news is 47 rules in there are more or less about semantics and not machine readable and not machine checkable, but nevertheless, checker software like in PDF editor gives you a protocol and helps you fix up, gives you fix up support in the editor, and then you get to a well tagged and thus accessible PDF much easier. And it's still also an ongoing task. So as I said, there is solutions out there in software. The standard is out there for a long time. But there's also still active work. For instance, in the PDF Association that I mentioned before, there's a technical working group called the Wilde Technical Working Group. All right, so trying to create guidelines on how to do that. Mostly maybe for software vendors. There's also the Matterhorn protocol about WellTech by the PDF Association. And as I said, it's difficult in hindsight, so we should educate the workforce to create the documents as accessible as possible in the first place, and then have very good software using this new work that is done in automating, doing the last and finishing touch-ups, so that, again, the burden of creating an accessible document, which from my point of view is absolutely necessary, is lowered. Although I think it doesn't come for free in the foreseeable time as well, right?
So what I'm hearing is we've got the guidelines out there. Pop quiz later, we'll ask you to name all 61 elements, but no, we'll lay you off that. But I think, Dave, what I would sort of like to hear from you is, we know the guidelines are there.
Yeah.
How much do they play through into the reality of how particularly public sector folks are behaving in terms of their creation of information when they're putting information out there?
Mm-hmm.
In a sense, there's so much information to take in potentially. Are they doing the right things, or are they overwhelmed by it? What do you see out in the field, David, in terms of that, the implementation of WCAG and other sort of useful guidelines like that?
You see a huge amount of variation at the country level. Yeah. And it's absolutely driven by the political imperative of the administration. That's the reality of government. So there are some governments that are a lot more open than others. That's kind of fact. But I think underpinning that is I think, and always strongly believe, that there is a combination of what's right, underpinned by legislation, not what's right because we told you so, which was Carsten's really good point earlier. But there's also what is readable and what is understandable, which is not necessarily what is accessible. And that's an important nuance, because this can play hand in hand with the software and the technology solutions out there that can make things accessible, but not always readable. So the human intervention piece about quality of writing is something that was here long before the internet, long before we did this stuff on IT. This is going back in the days of typing pools, and that should not be underestimated, that the drivers around legislation and all that kind of stuff is as much about that than it is around what the tech does today. The difference is what the tech does today is actually makes it really, really easy in two extreme ways. It makes it really easy to make unintelligible, awful documents that are huge and complex, right? And they can also make them look really good, but make them impossible to understand. Technology can do that brilliantly. In the same way, technology can do the reverse, can create very well crafted, very accessible, very easy to use and easy to engage with documents. Yep. But behind that is the skills of the authors, the skills of the designers, the skills of the communication function, but above all else, the imperative, the driver from those that are creating the need for those documents to engage effectively with their populations. Yeah. So when you play that through and you look at what does the legislation do, the legislation and government, where we see this working well, are those organizations that genuinely believe that they need to engage and engender the trust of their populations in doing what they do. Canada is one of the best examples globally and has been for a very, very long time. The US tends to follow Canada not long after, which is not a bad thing. Although there are some qualifiers we could put in there and probably spend a whole other podcast on. And in the UK, we're probably about 5 years behind both of those, but we get there. We just think about it for longer. Culturally, though, there are some real challenges within government. What this does do is it then challenges what should you tell people? What do you have a duty to tell people? And how do you tell them effectively? And the challenge in government around that is how you reconcile that desire, that duty to share, with the other duty that government does have, and this is where the conflict comes in, the duty to protect. So, and the real challenge in this whole area is around how you protect individual rights and privacy, whilst at the same time being transparent in what government does. Yeah. So best example of that in the UK has been the 15-year debate we've had around care.data, the NHS data. Yeah, I find it fascinating because, I mean, Carson, in the US, the residents have had, citizens have had full access to all of their detailed medical data for years. They take it with them. It's owned by them. It's not owned by health. In the UK, we still seem to labour under this illusion that the NHS owns our data. Never has been the case. And that's a really good example of where you hit that kind of challenge on that thinking. The other one that really kind of brings it home to me is FOI and redaction. Marston picked on some of it, we sort of touched on a bit of it earlier, and I think it's well worth exploring. So what's redaction about? Redaction, my default position, and I've always done this when I've done information governance and sharing with organizations, redaction is something you have to do because you have to protect specific rights and responsibilities. The default position should be you don't. The difficulty in a lot of government is the default position is black the page and then decide what words you're going to let people see, and we all see them on TV shows, the CIA specials, see a black with 3 words, that kind of thing. And that for me is a good measure of whether a country and administration is looking to include and to be transparent and to live up to the aspirations of gaining trust in the residents, or they have something to hide. It's kind of that simple.
Yeah, and I think that balancing act, or whether it's a tension or a balance between the needs or the desires of the public sector organization and then the people they're there to serve, and finding that right line between the two that delivers an optimum result for both parties is difficult. And there's another area that I think where that's relevant, and that's around, we're delivering more and more data, we're generating data, we're sharing information, trillions of PDFs in the world, and a good chunk of those probably come out of the public sector. And so there's increasing amounts of information that the public sector have to process, have to, filter, decide what they share, what they don't share. And so there's a desire and a sort of imperative in the public sector to generate pace, and to generate speed and agility. But at the same time, that can't come at the cost of the accessibility piece and the freedom of information and those inherently important and fundamental characteristics of information sharing. So how do we ensure that we don't sacrifice that piece in the pursuit of speed and processing for our internal teams in the public sector? There's a sort of innate tension there, and I'm interested in what your thoughts are on how we can make sure that we sort of toe the right side of the line as we wrestle with that one. And who wants to jump in on that one first? Because I guess it goes kind of to the heart of some of the fundamentals of democracy. So give you a couple of minutes each, and then we'll see where we get to. Maybe Carsten, you're smiling, so you look like you've got some thoughts on this issue.
Yeah, so I have a clear view on that. So when somebody says there is a risk that adding accessibility to a process of using a document-based process or something like that, and that slows down the production in our team, or the reaction times or something like that, then there's something wrong from the get-go, from my point of view. So from my point of view, we all know it, right? Nothing lasts as long as a makeshift, right? On the other hand, we also all know that doing it right in the first place is important. No, other than that, it would be very hard and very expensive later. So my statement is we have to design document-based processes from the get-go, always with accessibility in mind, right? And therefore, accessibility can't slow them down after, right? If they slow them down after, we did something wrong in the first place, right? And again, I think we have rules and regulations. We have education, bottom up, top down. And I also think that people are generally ready to do the right thing. And I'm saying government employees are generally ready to do the right thing, right? When they know what the right thing is, when we educated them, as I said, but also when, even if they know what the right thing is to do, and when the process is designed accordingly, when we have bad tools, they'll still try to find a way around it, right? Everybody knows that. That's human nature. And accessibility will not be free, as I said, fully effortless in the foreseeable times, but the tools get definitely better. So some prominent examples that are not really government relevant, but maybe so. If you save a PDF document now from Google Chrome, it's tagged, right? That's news. Same for Apple software doing it. If you save a PDF, it's tagged. It's not fully accessible, but it's tagged. That's a good point to start with. Word processors get better all the time if they are used correctly. And again, finally, document-based processes can't ignore accessibility at the design time. That's my statement. So they cannot be slowed down. I admit, from a software point of view, we came a long way with software and tools. There's good news every other day with regards to accessibility, with new releases of tools. There is AI technology introduced into these processes to help structure content in an accessible way. PDF desktop mobile support is very good. Automation came a long way, although that is the most challenging way when there is no human intelligence involved to make a document really accessible. They are useful. You can try that, but I admit we still have to get better on the software side. And there's a whole part of the industry working on just that, right? Applying the latest and greatest technology to make things easier in that way. And then we no longer can say we have too much to do to care about accessibility. That's the wrong thought from the get-go.
Yeah, absolutely. David, what's your thoughts on that?
Well, just building on, I mean, the great thing about principles, whether there's 160 of them, 130 of them, or 40 of them, principles are consistent. They can be written in code. They can be applied to products, and they can be deployed. In fact, a lot of them are. Question challenged back into the vendor market is why aren't all of them in there? And that's the bigger question. But the ambition, you know, this can be made easy for people producing documents if we embed it into the tools. Nobody writes their own word processing package anymore. We buy stuff, right? Whether it's the Microsoft, Google, it doesn't matter what, you buy a product, and that's what people type into, whatever it might be, up to and including Slack and beyond, right? Embed these principles into the functionality around those products, and you're getting a long way towards actually just making it easier for the users. That doesn't underestimate the fact that we still need to educate people about what good writing is. Yeah, because so much of this is about being succinct and articulate in what it is you're presenting, but the software and the market out there is more than capable of implementing these principles into the tech they deliver. Yeah. And government will embrace that and will drive it through. And so that, I think, is kind of where we are on that sort of piece there. The education bit around succinctness and stuff, one thing I think, sadly, over the last 30 years is word processing has taught people to be lazy. It's easy to type stuff and things like that. And so what we've seen is, I think, is a significant reduction in the quality of writing. You know, when writing was hard work, yeah, you thought more carefully about what you wrote. Yeah. These days it's easy to generate a lot of crap quickly. So it's kind of, so there's and that's not tech, that's just human nature kind of building out. So we shouldn't underestimate the importance, I think, of that shift in culture. But back to my earlier point, and we kind of said it right towards the beginning, and Carsten brought it out really well, which is, you know, the industry, the software industry, has in its capability, in its gift, the ability to embrace these standards, embed them in the products, and deploy them out there. The open standards initiatives that are out there have demonstrated how brilliant this can be done. Look at what they've done with open banking. Look what they've done with GIS. Great to hear, Carson, what you're doing actually on spatial data and stuff like that. We nail standards around that stuff because it isn't all words. It's also as much about visuals as anything else, and other mediums. And I've had a long-standing view that GIS is the as yet undiscovered country in terms of deploying very, very rich, complex data in a more legible format. So there's some things to play through. WCAG deployed across all the GIS platforms. Wouldn't that be nice?
Yeah, I agree. You throw a ball at the vendors here a little bit. I mean, you put it in context. No worries, all good. But I just want to catch that ball and say something about that. So first, tools really get better. You have to admit it. Even the word processor. So when you create a PowerPoint presentation, let's say in the latest version, and you add an image into it, there's a box popping up saying put the alt text in here, right? Helping those who write content to do the right thing. And when you look at software, you always look at the hard stuff, right? You give the hard stuff to the software, and then you say, figure it out, go figure it out. And I guess we made huge progress on that using. At Foxit, we work on many years now on something we call a layout recognition engine, right? You throw a piece of document at us and we try to figure out in hindsight, what has the author's intention been, right? What's the best reading order for this document? With this all machine learning and AI technology, there is still a long way to go. We can improve that a lot, but we also came a long way with that. And assume you scan a page into something like our Foxit PDF editor, right? You scan a page, all you have is an image. Now you want to have that content accessible. So there's a built-in OCR creating a readable text first, right? Then there's the LR engine in there creating a structure level on top of that text. Then there's an accessibility checker protocol in there creating a protocol for you saying, here and there is still a problem with accessibility. And then there's an editor helping you touch up that, right? So from a vendor perspective, first, we would also like to not only get the hard stuff presented to us. Secondly, of course we do, because we're paid for fixing the difficult problems, right? But also we came a long way. And I think the tools are much better. You just need to take a new look at it. And I guess if we, again, take that bottom-up, top-down approach and add those tools to our workflows, design those workflows with accessibility in mind from the get-go, we could do way better than we do today, I guess.
So
no, I've got to agree with you on that one, Carson.
No reason to wait on something, I'm saying, right? Yeah. Just get going.
And I think the important point from what you were saying earlier was really important. Anybody that comes, when I was a CIO, if somebody had come to me and said, "I can't publish this because it's going to be difficult, and I've got to have to spend some time and accessibility and all that," and I'd be going, "Sorry, that's just not acceptable." The tools, and we have an imperative to do something. It's not a reason not to do things. It's not an excuse that can be deployed. And back to the earlier point. I mean, my challenge out there with the vendor market, I agree 100% that it's come forward. I remember what it used to be like when people were doing stuff in HTML1. Yeah. It was about 1 million miles away from making anything accessible in those days. Yeah. Look at what we have now. It's fantastic. Yeah. And the range of media that people can engage with, through voice, video, as well as or through through text and other visual, I think has completely changed the game. And it's like with anything else, I guess, in the marketplace. If there are principles, my challenge always with all vendors in all aspects of technology is, implement those principles, build them into your core product set, make it happen, and it makes life easier for everyone else. And you've given some really good examples of where Foxit's done some of that and quite a lot of that stuff and continue to go on. What's heartening to hear is that you're absolutely front and center and you want to keep doing it. Good, crack on.
Yeah.
Oh, absolutely.
I'd like to. I mean, Carsten's spoken a bit about the fact that there are elements like AI and RPA that are coming into the processes now and will potentially be much more prevalent in the way we process information in the future. From your perspective, David, looking at the public sector side of things, if that technology comes to fruition, how could it potentially change the way public sector organizations collect, process, and use information? What are the opportunities there if we can build in this automation process, this AI parts of the way we collate and handle information?
Yeah, you're always going to have to do this in tandem with the individual's rights and all that consent piece, because they go hand in glove, these two things. But we're actually seeing it happen today. I mean, what's going on with census in the UK this year? You know, it's not a 50-page document sent out to God knows how many millions of households to fill in and send back, as the one was 10 years ago. This year, it's been drawing information from multiple available sources and only asking people for information that they genuinely shouldn't and can't get from that variety of sources. But back to the accessibility and the visibility, the way in which the request for that core information from the whole country has been driven entirely digitally, across the UK, it's kind of everyone's just not noticed the fact that we've actually conducted a 10-year census of the entire population using digital means during COVID. And that, for me, kind of demonstrates that's a 10-year gap, and we have fundamentally transformed what that can look like. Now, what's really going to be interesting off the back of that is what then do you do about the output from that and render that in usable, accessible ways to help do what censuses are for, which is to inform decision making, you know, how you're going to run the country for the next 10 years, all that cool stuff. Yeah. And I think, and also how you then make that information available in accessible and usable formats for multiple organizations to take advantage of it, to do everything from economic gain through helping the most vulnerable in our society.
Yeah, absolutely.
Sounds like a job for PDF, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, what I'm hearing from you both is that the willing is absolutely there within the public sector. The technology is moving at a pace to sort of fulfill that need and desire. And so I guess the education piece and the getting to these behaviors at source so that people use the tools in the right way, they understand what they're supposed to be doing and how, then we can continue to build that accessibility throughout the vast swathes of information that we inevitably sort of pumping out in the public sector. So it's great to be able to sort of spread the word and keep that mantra flowing, and we'll do our part here as well to obviously sort of push that out across our audience throughout. You know, we're dealing with a lot of people providing services and information publicly, so good to bring that front and center. So just want to thank you both for the conversation, because as we said, you know, accessibility of information goes to the absolute heart of democracy. So it's something that we can't ignore, and great to hear that both the public sector and the vendor side are really working hard and maybe coming together to build that between them, which is always the best way. So in that spirit of collaboration, thanks to you both for joining us for the conversation.
Thank you, Tim, for inviting us. Thanks, David, for the chat.
That's great.